The word love appears no less than 9 times in the 9 verses that we have from the Gospel of John today. Were our author writing an academic paper, we might accuse him of a stunning lack of any semantic diversity. But then I think maybe that's the purpose and the point. Sometimes writing sermons, I feel like I talk about the same thing all the time, and then I realize that actually Scripture talks about the same thing all the time. It's a little on repeat, because that's kind of what it takes to get that love is the core message to sink into our hearts. In today's passage from John's Gospel, Jesus talks about commandments and love, which maybe we don't normally put together, but Jesus melds them together. Jesus seems to understand that there's a human tendency, particularly when it comes to religion, to take the core purpose of something and layer onto it a bunch of commandments and rules that define what belonging means. So, by the time Jesus comes onto the scene, his context, right, is first century Judaism. Rules and regulations are kind of the bread and butter of life in the Jewish world. And that goes back like centuries to a guy named Moses who received the law from God on a mountain. And the purpose of the law was to have people live in right relationship with God, in right relationship with one another, and bless the nations. But over time, that purpose got a little forgotten. And what became more important were the laws themselves. They were supposed to be means to a different end, to the purpose. But they became ends in themselves. Belonging, and whether you were doing things right, wasn't about the purpose. It was about following the law perfectly. This is why Jesus spends an enormous amount of time talking to his fellow scribes and Pharisees about how they tie heavy burdens on people's back. That he does the Sermon on the Mount to reinstill the purpose of the law, to remind people why the commandments exist in the first place, to reiterate purpose. I don't think we should point our fingers at anyone in first century Judaism for getting a little obsessed by rules and orders and norms and behaviors, because it's a pretty human tendency. It's at the heart of any organization that people come together for a purpose. Individuals are drawn together around something they believe they can achieve together that you can't achieve by yourself. Something to hope for, to build a better society, to play sports together, to have an interest together. But it doesn't take looking at many organizations to realize how quickly it's a human inclination to take the purpose and build onto it a bunch of rules and a bunch of regulations and a bunch of norms, and the purpose gets buried. I don't know, take a moment. Think about schools. Think about politics and governments. Think about churches. It happens really quickly. And Jesus seems to know that this is just true about humans operating. And so he says, you know what? We'll simplify it. You want to have a bunch of rules that help you understand the purpose? The rule and the purpose is this: love one another as I have loved you. Let's simplify it. It may seem like nothing, but the fact is that if the purpose is loving others, being in right relationship with God and others, and the first rule is love others, there is no other commandment. There is nothing to layer on top of that. I'm always flummoxed by debates about the 10 Commandments because we have one commandment: love people as God has loved you. So the debate isn't about, well, which behaviors are acceptable, what's the norms and expectations. The conversation is not about which is the greatest commandment. The conversation is about how we live the one commandment. Is it loving or is it not loving? And if it's not loving, let's go in a different direction. And that seems kind of evident, but of course it's not. Or Jesus wouldn't have repeated himself 9 times in 9 verses, and we really wouldn't have the New Testament. Because once you kind of dive into the New Testament, you realize that a great many of those books are letters written to Christian communities who are layering all kinds of other rules on top of the command to love. For example, the Galatians. They've decided that circumcision is more important than loving other people, and that's the norm in their community. So the letter gets written to remind them, no, love is the norm. And our friends, the Corinthians, who are beset by myriad problems about which this sermon is not, but decide that the most important thing is a hierarchy of spiritual gifts. And if you can speak in tongues, buddy, you're the top. And the letter, part of the letter of 1 Corinthians is reminding people, no, there is no top, there is no bottom. There is only love, and everyone participates equally. And our friends, the Thessalonians, decide to just abdicate responsibility. No need to love anyone. Jesus is coming back, so grab a picnic blanket and let's stare at the sky and watch for him. So there's only a slight reduction, only a slight loss. And so the letter of 1 Corinthians gets written to remind people, no, you can't do nothing. Love requires you to do something. You must care about others and live in community with them. And so we could kind of point our fingers and, say, those early people, they didn't get it. But we're all wrestling with something. To my knowledge, our particular community isn't wrestling with those issues, but you could disabuse me after this. But, we're all wrestling with something. Because it's a human propensity to want rules and regulations to define belonging instead of just love. Because that requires us to kind of live with each other. It requires us to experience the diversity of one another. It means we all get to lend our gifts, though, in different ways. So the interesting question this passage asks us is, how are we living love? But more deeply than that, we're all here, aren't we? Something about the love of God has grasped us, or seems intriguing to us. We're a little bit interested, at least. What is it that we imagine we contribute? What is it we imagine about our purpose in the world together? What is it we imagine that we could do for love? And the gifts of this place are none other than the gifts of the people gathered. What are the gifts that we offer to loving one another? And how do we spill them forth into the community? But of course, there's the flip side of the question that we'd rather not ask, that's a little more difficult and requires some self-awareness and reflection. What blocks us from loving one another? We have to tap into our own personal and collective assumptions, expectations, and biases to remove whatever blocks us from loving others. But always to return to the question, the purpose is love. The commandment is to love. And if it's not that, let's not do it. But let's do ask us who we want to be. What is the way that we love one another? Jesus said, "This is my commandment, that you love others as I have loved you."